In what many thought was going to be a repeat of the national championship game from last January, Texas and Michigan square off, 12 Eastern on Fox. Both teams actually look quite a bit different than last year's playoff participants. The Wolverines, of course, had 13 players drafted. That was the most of any school. Jim Harbaugh then left to become the head coach at the San Diego. Don't say that. Los Angeles Chargers. And the Longhorns, of course, had 11 selected as well. So very different looking teams from where they were a year ago. Now, Texas is actually the first top 5 non-conference opponent to visit the Big House since 1991. I found that kind of interesting, right? 33 years since a top 5 non-conference opponent was there in Ann Arbor to take on Michigan. That was Florida State back in 91. They were ranked number 1, and they beat Michigan 51-31. So it's been a while, and the last time it was not good for the Michigan Wolverines. Let's go into the keys of the games. What are the question marks that we have when evaluating the matchup? Number 1, will Texas's new weapons be able to attack an elite secondary? Now, the Longhorns lost all of their receivers last year for the most part. Their top 5 wideouts from last season, gone. Did not slow them down at all in the season opener. It shouldn't. It was Colorado State. They went out and they attacked the portal. They went and got big-time transfers. And all 3 of their transfers looked pretty good in the opener. Isaiah Bond, transferred from Alabama, had a touchdown. Matthew Golden, transferred from Houston, had a couple touchdowns. And then Silas Bolden from Oregon State also added a score on his own. And what Sark has said this offseason, that this might be the most ideal scenario for his wide receiver corps. Look, their top 6 wide receivers, Bolden, Cook, Golden, Bond, DeAndre Moore, and Ryan Wingo, they're all kind of interchangeable. Last year's group, if you remember at Texas, they had 3 guys that played almost exclusively all the time, and they all had their roles. You had A.D. Mitchell, who was long, difficult cover in a jump ball contested catch situation. You had Whittington, who was super reliable on third down, and you had Xavier Worthy, who was a catch and run guy. Well, now the top 6 wideouts for the Longhorns are all interchangeable, so they can all do a bunch of different things, which is going to allow the creativity of Steve Sarkisian to come to the forefront. Well, they're going against an elite secondary. We all know about Will Johnson. If you look at Will Johnson's performance last week against Fresno, not very good. He gave up 5 catches on 8 targets for 77 yards. We're not used to seeing that from Will Johnson, so hopefully that was just a one-off, and he'll bounce back in a big way this year. He did have the 86-yard pick 6, which covered up some of the inconsistencies in coverage that he had on the other 8 times he was targeted. Zeke Berry and Jair Hill both look super athletic. Berry had a first quarter interception that kind of flipped things in Michigan's favor early, and Hill allowed just 16 receiving yards on 5 targets in coverage. Now, the back end, everybody should be pretty good right there. They didn't allow much. Even though they had a bunch of covered snaps, there wasn't much given up through the air against Fresno State. That's a huge matchup. Wide receivers of Texas, secondary of the Michigan Wolverines. Question number 2, will Michigan's passing game actually be a threat? Now, Davis Warren made his first career start for Michigan last week in the season opener. He completed 15 of 25, 118. That's right, 118. Not a real sexy number there as far as yards per attempt was concerned. But that's kind of the recipe for Michigan. I mean, that was actually their 8th win in the last 3 years when they finished with 150 or fewer passing yards. That's the 4th most in the FBS, behind a couple academies in Air Force and Army, and then Iowa. So that just kind of goes to show you, throwing it for less than 150 and winning is rare nowadays in college football. But Michigan does it with pretty good regularity. They're going to be all right. They also, I think, have the best tight end in the country. Colson Loveland was amazing last week. He was targeted 9 times, caught 8 of 9, bunch of first downs, super reliable for the first-year starting quarterback, David Warren. Problem is, outside of Loveland, I don't love what I saw from Michigan's pass catchers. The receivers, the tight ends, the running backs, just 7 catches. Just 7 catches on 18 attempts for 34 yards and 4 first downs. So it wasn't great. You did have the touchdown to Edwards, but man, you look at the wideouts in particular, not great. It also was not great. The Davis Warren was just 1 for 6 with an interception on passes that traveled more than 10 yards downfield. And the way you beat Texas last year was through the air because their secondary was vulnerable. Will they be this year? I don't know. But that was the way you attacked them a year ago. And if Michigan can't, will they be able to win the game? Let's go next to number 3. If they can't throw it, can Michigan run it? That's the question. Khalil Mullings did a great job last week. Awesome. Made a great pitch to become the number 1 overall running back. Looked a little bit more like Hassan Haskins than he did a fifth-year senior converted linebacker that he was. I mean, he was 15 for 92, averaged over 6 per carry, had a bunch of yards after contact. You also have Alex Orji, who you know is going to be a potential weapon in the run game, carry the ball 5 times for 32 yards. But I thought it was concerning to watch the offensive line for Michigan. Now, they had to replace their top 6 offensive linemen from last year, and they had to replace Blake Corum, their outstanding running back. And though the returnees along the O-line have experience, they didn't look very good against Fresno State. Lack of chemistry, looked like there was few lapses in communication that led to a really inefficient rushing attack, which I'm not used to seeing from Michigan. The offensive line, that was not a recognizable performance, and as a result, it snapped a pretty nice streak of 29 games with a touchdown run. That was the second longest active streak in the FBS entering the season behind Georgia, and it is now dead. And Texas last year was one of the best run defenses in the country. Now, both their defensive tackles are gone, but there were a bunch of players in the rotation, so it'll be interesting to see how they backfill some of those spots. And then finally, question number 4. How will Texas's offensive line hold up? Notice how I've talked about the Michigan O-line, the Texas O-line, receivers versus corners. Like, I think this is a line of scrimmage game, and then you have some individual matchups on the outside. Like, we're not talking a lot about what Quinn Ewers can do. We know what Quinn Ewers is. He's only going to be able to win the game if he has a great supporting cast that steps up against what I think is an excellent defense. Now, Michigan, they allowed just 9 rushing yards last week against Fresno. They were really good. And while you take some of the sacks out of the equation, you look at their front 4, they're rock solid. Mason Graham, Kenneth Grant, God's honest truth, I didn't think they played very well last week, but I would expect them to be a whole lot better this week. A whole lot better, for sure. And their edge rushing duo of Josiah Stewart and Derek Moore, they look primed for a really nice year. They had some nice pressures off the edges, and I thought the opener was pretty decent. Now, new defense coordinator Wink Martindale, we know he wants to pressure. We know he wants to blitz. He was actually number 2 in the NFL last year in blitz rate. Against Fresno, they brought pressure, and I think that's going to be something to watch. The cat and mouse game between Texas's O-line and protection and Steve Sarkisian calling the plays against Wink Martindale and how much he decides to pressure. So I look at some of the trends in the game. Michigan is 4-0 against the spread, against top 10 teams dating back to last season. And Texas is the first time favored in a road game against a top 10 opponent since 2008. You know what game that was? That was the Texas Tech game where Michael Crabtree scored the game-winning touchdown with 1 second remaining. They were a 3.5-point favorite on that day. The under is hit in each of Texas's last 4 road games, and the under is 12-3-1 in Michigan home games since the start of 2022. Based on what I saw last week, I think Texas is ahead of Michigan at this point. I think the offensive line of Michigan is a concern. I think Texas's weapons will be able to create enough space, and I think the veteran play of Quinn Ewers gives Texas a slight advantage. He's won big games, and I think he can do so again on the road in what should be a hostile environment. I like the Texas Longhorns.